Hello and welcome to the second International Journal of Nautical Archaeology webinar. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in. We've received lots of encouragement after our first webinar that took place in January on the subject of First and Second World War battleships, so thank you for all your comments. If you missed it, you can catch up on the Nautical Archaeology Society YouTube channel or through the Nautical Archaeology Society website. Our aim with these webinars is to provide a platform for discussion of themes that arise from articles published in the IJNA and to give our audience the chance to ask our authors about their research. Okay, so for today's discussion, I wanted to look at the different ways ships and boats arrive in the archaeological record. We tend to talk about shipwrecks and to use that as a blanket term for all manner of events. But when you start looking more closely, the stories that ship remains can tell, both of their working lives and what happens to them next, is hugely varied. Although the deep sea shipwreck might be what leaps to mind when we first think of nautical archaeology, a great deal of recent work is being done in the intertidal zones and on dry-ish land, as well as underwater, but in harbours, rivers and estuaries. So today I've gathered 4 researchers who work in very different regions and very different time periods, but who have all recently published articles in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology about boats and ship remains that are not wrecks in the conventional terms. And I've asked them to talk about what the often rich assemblages they encounter can tell us about the maritime history of the sites they study. So I'm very pleased to welcome Nathan Richards. Nathan is Associate Professor and Director of Maritime Studies at East Carolina University in the United States. But it was as a graduate student at Flinders University in Australia that he first got interested in ship graveyards. I'm not sure if I shouldn't say obsessed with ship graveyards. And he's really made this his speciality. Nathan, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Miranda. I appreciate being involved in this. Greetings from a dark room in sunny North Carolina.
But we've got Damian Robinson. Damian is Director of the Oxford Centre for Maritime Archaeology, and he's also a Nautical Archaeology Society trustee. He's a classical archaeologist with research interests spanning the maritime terrestrial interface, and much of his time in recent years has been investigating the complicated archaeology of the Nile Delta at Taunus Eraklyon. It's a port site, but it's now submerged, and it dates to the 5th century BC. Hi, Damian.
Hello, Miranda.
Next up is Ellie Graham. Ellie is a research assistant at St Andrews School of History, working with the highly successful SCAPE project. I've been following the SCAPE project pretty much since it started, and they're doing really sensational work looking at the archaeology of Scotland's coastline, especially where threatened by climate change. This huge undertaking has been made possible by engaging a task force of local volunteers who set their own research agendas. I strongly encourage, look, they've got their banner up to show you. I strongly encourage you to check it out. Hi, Ellie, how are you?
Hi, Miranda, very well, thanks. Hi from Scotland, and thanks for the invitation to take part.
And lastly, we have Jean-Sébastien Guibert, who's based at the University of the Antilles and has long studied the maritime archaeology of Martinique and Guadeloupe. Recently, he was lead author for an IJNA article that outlines 4 decades of maritime research in the region, both on land and underwater. Jean-Sébastien, welcome, bienvenue.
Hi, thank you very much for invitation, and thank you very much for organization of this webinar. Thank you.
So we're going to start by coming back to Nathan. Nathan published his thesis on ship graveyards in 2008 and edited a collection of papers titled The Archaeology of Water Abandonment in 2013. But today I've given him the unenviable task of briefly introducing what is in fact a huge subject, as we'll see. And perhaps he'll also refer to the Mayor's boatyard vessel in Bermuda, which he recently published in the IJNA. So Nathan, over to you.
So I've structured my presentation into two parts. The first part is really to briefly mention the work on the Myers Boatyard vessel, which is in St. George's Parish in Bermuda, and then which is the work done by East Carolina University in 2008. And then the second part will move on to a broader consideration regarding the intentional placement and discard of watercraft. So this is the location. You can see where the Myers Boatyard vessel is. Before I really get into detail about depositional variety, I'd like to acknowledge the paper was co-written by Peter Campbell, Calvin Myers, and Joe Hoyt. We all shared the tasks of recording the vessel. But in 2008, as a part of a collaboration with the National Museum of Bermuda and with the support of Bermuda's Department of Conservation Services, we were asked to undertake an assessment of this vessel, which is in the path of a proposed development of marina by a company named WEC Limited. As a part of this work, the team undertook a traditional maritime archaeological recording of the remains, which is a very highly intact vessel, via scale drawing and photo mosaics, and then moving on to some 3D modeling work that was done by John Wagner, who was a graduate student here at ECU at the time. During our assessment work, we also sought to consider all the clues that were provided to us in the archaeological site regarding the pre and post depositional contexts of the ship to determine whether the vessel was wrecked or abandoned. Our conclusion was that the vessel was a Medina-class gunboat representing either the remains of the HMS Medina or the HMS Medway. Both of these vessels were in Bermuda towards the end of their military service. Both were converted into hulks, and both are believed to have been lost somewhere in Bermuda. Local people maintain that the vessel we were looking at is the HMS Medway, although we don't feel like we can make a definitive identification based upon the information we have. In our IJNA paper, we lean towards an abandonment hypothesis as the explanation for its deposition, though the presence of salvageable items on its deck leave room for alternative explanations, such as the unintentional loss of perhaps an unwanted hulk. That's really all I want to say about the Medina-class gunboat in Bermuda, although, quite honestly, the history and significance of the site is probably owed a whole other series of presentations by my co-authors. But what I really want to focus on now is the idea of the diversity of depositional contexts we might encounter as we interpret the remains of shipwrecks. And from here, really, my work is particularly influenced by the work of maritime archaeologists in Australia from the 1970s, in particular, Dr. Michael McCarthy, who really was one of the first people to start looking at ships' graveyard sites in Australia. And in the 1990s, students working under Dr. Mark Staniforth at Flinders University began doing similar work. Using a behavioral archaeological paradigm, the team at Flinders University started thinking about depositional contexts of shipwrecks within a behavioral spectrum, sort of a range that considers that ships are deposited into the archaeological record in ways that may be totally outside of their control, such as in the case of catastrophic or unintentional wrecking events, or maybe totally within their control, such as in the case of well thought out and planned deliberate discard events. Taking this a step further, we began to think about what the archaeological signatures, or sort of the jargon for the indelible scars and signs of human actions on archaeological remains on watercraft sites may be left behind, and how that could allow us to infer human agency as we read these archaeological sites. Of course, when working in large clusters of ships, such as those that remain in ships' graveyards, the other questions we started to ask were whether the recurrence of these signatures could provide insight into generalizable human behaviors across time, and perhaps even across other sites across the planet. One of the things you might have noticed is that in the previous slide, I was talking about the most catastrophic or deliberate processes may culminate in ships being deposited in the archaeological record. I use the phrase maybe totally. This is because in many circumstances, humans still make choices as to where they steer their imminently lost ship, and in all cases, individual humans or the ship owners aren't in control of the social, economic, and technological circumstances of the operation of their ships. One of the clues to this are the events and processes that occur to a ship throughout its use. Ships that aren't wrecked may be laterally cycled into functions that they weren't originally meant for. Some may be adaptively reused into radically different functions, and others may find new functions once they are discarded. These actions will have major implications for the types of structures and the richness of artifacts a maritime archaeologist may expect to find on an archaeological site. So if you consider the fact that, say, a paddle steamer like the gem that I'm showing up here on the top right-hand corner, once operated as a paddle steamer but was converted into a bridge, you would expect that in that process of lateral cycling that the material culture assemblages would be radically different if you then go and abandon the gem that had served as a bridge for a number of decades. It might not be rich in artifacts. Similarly, in the case of relatively modern reuse of vessels such as breakwaters, in the case in the bottom right-hand corner, the Tangalooma breakwater, you would expect these highly intact vessels to be relatively cleared of material culture in the process of preparing them for their eventual discard. Indeed, these economic and technological circumstances are important contextual considerations in looking at these sites. You can consider the decision a ship owner of an unwanted ship might make. Do you spend resources to tow a ship to sea, or do you run it aground? How much salvage do you do before this action? The decision is often dictated by technological circumstances. For example, if a vessel is old or is unprofitable to run because of the technological limitation or perhaps the cost of fuel, or it contains salvageable materials that can turn a profit. We can often think of the loss of a ship as being connected to these techno-economic circumstances that drive the manner of its deposition. In this way, intactness variety is intertwined with depositional context. The decision to scuttle a vessel such as the Musgrave in an officially sanctioned ship's graveyard off of the coast of Tasmania in 1930 is probably dictated by the fact that at the time in 1930 maybe there's a low market for scrap metal, whereas in 1945 if you're running the Margaret ashore and burning it, you're probably intending to salvage fasteners from it, and at that point perhaps the market for scrap is high. I should also note here that these cases are mostly in the context of regular commerce. There are other considerations when we think about the abandonment of naval vessels because of the tendency for nations to maintain mothball fleets. And there are also considerations when we deal with strategic discard in the context of war, and also in the cases of ritualistic discard. In both cases, vessels may not be completely stripped, and in these cases, the hulls may be substantially full of material culture assemblages. But there are other clues to the ships that provide information about post-discard circumstances. For example, economic circumstances can change after abandonment, and in some cases we can infer pre- and post-depositional salvage. The location of many discarded ships shows us locations that at the time were peripheral to the routes of traffic and indicate that pre-depositional salvage occurred off-site to the degree that a floating condition was still possible. Years later, scrap prices may make the resalvage of vessels attractive, and secondary salvage may occur. And actually, in this point, I thought it was very interesting reviewing the first webinar and listening to Kieran Hosty's talk about the salvage of the HMAS Perth and how scrap prices drove the resalvage of a sunken vessel at a point where they could perhaps perceived as turning a profit. But on sites like the Grace Darling, which is the image that I have on this slide, you can notice large variations in pre- and post-depositional salvage. It's sometimes also possible to look at the archaeological remains to notice potential clues to the different economic status of salvages. From the 19th century, pre-depositional salvage may have been undertaken on a large scale by major salvage firms with blowtorches, and later post-depositional salvage may occur with less infrastructure by small groups with things like saws and chisels. Both groups leave the clues of their activities on the ferrous structures of these abandoned vessels. Other clues illuminating depositional contexts exist. At many watercraft, At many places, watercraft are still owned by someone even after their discard. Upon abandonment, a vessel may pose a risk to the owner. Abandoning vessels were known to rise with the tide and float about, often damaging working vessels or destroying infrastructure. So to avoid this, even heavily salvaged vessels were often pinned to the substrate with pilings or filled with spoil and gravel. In other cases, such as in the case of the Moe or the Moe on the right-hand side of this slide, we see a case of a ship that was historically documented as having floated away at high tide and having destroyed a lot of infrastructure. When it was redeposited, it was substantially scrapped more, but in order to stop it from floating away, they abandoned another vessel on top of it, breaching that vessel's hull in order to weigh it down. And so this becomes another signature of that intentionality to leave it in place. So this sort of gives you a bit of an overview of some of the broadest categories of depositional contexts, especially in relation to deliberately discarded vessels. But finishing up with this presentation, it's important to say that we know that wrecked and discarded ships are dispersed across the planet. In the case of discarded vessels, they accumulate any place that watercraft have been used and likely span the entirety of the time humans have carried themselves in vessels on the water. Many researchers have now worked on discarded watercraft, so often found in these port contexts. And from this research, whether it is done on ships' graveyards in the United States or in Bermuda or in Australia or on isolated discard sites in places like Costa Rica, we do begin to see common archaeological signatures and in many cases recurring spatial patterns. A remaining question comes back to whether generalizable human behaviors can be inferred on sites, irrespective of age and location. Thanks for listening. I'll throw it back to Miranda.
Thanks, Nathan. That was great. So next up is going to be Damian Robinson, and we're going to see how many of the processes that you've introduced us to can be seen in a completely different context in Egypt, in the Nile Delta, looking at wooden ships, because we're going to Taunus Eraklyon, where more than 70 ancient vessels have so far been located. Okay, Damian, it's over to you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. I'd like to start with this first image of Taunus Eraklyon, which is an artistic impression of this city, where we've discovered all of these ancient ships. It's here to show us that this is a watery landscape, and gives us an idea why it's necessary for the different types of ships and boats that we're encountering in the archaeological record. Just to give you some background, the port was active in the first millennium BC, mainly during Egypt's late period, when it becomes the country's premier emporium, and it's trading with the Greeks and with the Persian worlds. Now, following the foundation of Alexandria in about 331 BC and the transferal of trade to that city, Taunus Eraklyon continues, not as a port, but with an economy built around this large temple that you can see in the image, and its festivals. And this lasts until about the 2nd century BC, when the temple is largely destroyed in a catastrophic earthquake, or a catastrophic event at least that sees the liquefaction of the soil on which the temple is built. So this is a very large project on which I'm just a very small part. It's directed by Frank Gurriot and the European Institute of Underwater Archaeology, and is sponsored by the Hilti Foundation. And we work in close collaboration with Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities. So just to give you, again, a bit of an indication of where it is, the port city is located in the northwest of the Nile Delta. It's submerged beneath about 8 meters of water in Abukir Bay, which itself is some 30 kilometers northeast of Alexandria. So Taunus Eraklyon is situated at the end of the Canopic branch of the River Nile, which is the major western navigable branch of the river. And it provides access to the cities further up the Nile. So the port's consequently a place of trade, taxation, but also surveillance and defense for Egypt. Now, this particular map is centered around what we've called the Central Island. This was the location of the major temple of Amun of the Gareb, the remains of which are visible here as the small little white blocks, which are representative of the limestone blocks and the temple was built on, and the locations of where we found them. So the small blue triangles indicate the locations of over 700 ancient anchors, which have been found during the course of the work in the city, and which help to define the major anchorages and the waterways of the port. You can also see quite a few of these blue lozenge shapes, which are the locations of the remains of watercraft. As Miranda said, we found over 70 of these now in the port. So at present, only 2 of these have been completely excavated and have been published or are being written up. And these are ships 17, which is C on the image, and 11, which is B on the image. And then added to this, there are a couple more vessels which are currently under investigation. So there's ship 61, which is located at A, and 43, which is located at D. Now, from this, we can infer, from this collection of watercraft that we've discovered, we can infer that there are perhaps 3-4 different ways in which ships are deposited, and boats are deposited in the waters of Heracleion. But this image also shows us how we find them, which is mainly during the surveys in the port basins. And so the first thing is to remove the soil, the sand around the edges where the wood is protruding from the sand, the underlying clays, and then to map it, to draw it, to take samples for radiocarbon and for wood species analysis. And for the majority of vessels, this is all we do with them. They're left preserved in situ. What this has allowed us, because we have such a large number of them, is it's allowed Frank Goddio to make strategic research-based decisions about which ships to examine in greater detail. So from the excavations that we've done, coupled with our knowledge of the vessels that have been discovered during the survey, and their place in the larger landscape of Taunus Eraklyon, it rapidly became apparent that we weren't dealing with 70+ shipwrecks, and that a number of these different processes were responsible for the creation of the assemblage. So we do have shipwrecks, but we also have 2 large groups of vessels that were either reused as parts of port infrastructure or were discarded in a ship graveyard. And then the most numerically insignificant group, and perhaps we've only got 1 of these vessels, was a ritually deposited one. So what I'll do is go through some of these, these different types, and look at the types of evidence that we get. So firstly, we do have things that we might think of as classic shipwrecks, that is, ships that were fully loaded with trading goods, which foundered upon the sandbanks and the bars of the channels into the harbour. But illustrated here is perhaps a slightly different type of wrecking. This is an excavation shot of ship 61, and it would appear that this vessel was tied up at the southern quay of the central island at the end of the 2nd century BC, and it was caught up in the catastrophic destruction of the temple. So here you can see one of the large limestone blocks that once formed part of the quayside, as well as pottery and other material that flowed down from the central island into the waterway and swamped ship 61. So our excavations here show that it was unloaded at the time, and consequently the majority of the material culture associated with this wreck came from the destruction of the temple, rather than being related to the ship itself. In the central port, there's a group of 10 or so vessels that appear to have been tethered together in pairs and ballasted with limestone. One of these, ship 43, has been excavated in some detail. Now, importantly, all of these ships appear to be the same size. They're all built in the same construction style. They also date from the same time in the 5th to 4th century BC. And the ships themselves seem to be all different type, the same type of an Egyptian river barge known as a barris. So this group of vessels has been interpreted as being the remains of a pontoon bridge, for which there's some support in the classical texts. And it would appear to be a sensible solution for the reuse of old vessels that are no longer required for transportation purposes, and particularly as such a thing like a pontoon bridge could rise and fall with the flood of the Nile. A second example of structural reuse of this is ship 17. Like 43 and the others of the pontoon bridge, ship 17 appears to have been initially cut down to its hull, which was then presumably floated into a position adjacent to a small island on the northern side of the central basin. It's then staked into position, using 14 wooden piles that were driven up to 3 meters into the clays of the harbour bottom. And this is a substantial number, which may be for more than just the securing of the hulk into its position, and may have been to support an overlying timber superstructure, perhaps the decking for a wharf. So here then it's clear that ship 17 is being used perhaps to extend the length of the long narrow jetty to which it was attached, perhaps into deeper water. And this activity has been dated to somewhere in the 5th century BC. There's also evidence for what could be the abandonment and dumping of unwanted vessels at the western end of the central port. And this is a ship graveyard, characterized by vessels of different type, different size, that appear to have been dumped here over a long period of time. And the date ranges that we have go from about the third intermediate period through into the Ptolemaic period. So the entire span of life in this port. They're also found superimposed over each other without any form of order. So this group of ships and boats would consequently be a good candidate for an abandonment graveyard. It's as if this area of the central port was locally recognized as the place to which unwanted ships were taken to be dumped. Here, the vessels appear to have been scuttled without any effort made to recycle their timbers, and perhaps this indicates that wood's not necessarily in short supply in this particular port. And then finally, we have the issue of ritual deposition, which is seen in our excavations of ship 11 and our wider contextual excavations around it. Ship 11 is a small 10-meter long vessel. It's got a crescentic hull form. It was deliberately sunk through the removal of keel planks at the bow of the vessel. The tenons of the plank were carefully sawn through to remove it. The boat's then carefully positioned across the western end of the Grand Canal before the water was let in to scuttle the ship. And this is aided by ballasting it with limestone. So we can start to build up why we think it's ritually deposited. And the first clue, I suppose, comes from the fact of the wood that it's built out of. It's made from sycamore fig, which is seldom used. It's only used in this particular ship in the entirety of the assemblage of Taunus Eraklyon. It's also the wood that's sacred to Osiris and is mentioned in prayers on Egyptian tomb walls as being the wood used in the construction of Osiris's Neshmet bark. The boat itself is really well made, with very thin planks that were joined using finely carved mortise and tenon joints. It's a work of real craftsmanship, which is very different from the working boats that we see in the other excavated vessels. And what helps us with this interpretation is also its location, where it was found, and the objects that were deposited around it. So it appears to have been deliberately sunk at the western end of the Grand Canal and was extremely carefully placed between two small shrines on the adjacent riverbanks. The West has a particular significance in the Egyptian religion through its association with the god Osiris, who's known as the foremost of the West and the lord of the netherworld. Around the boat and also around the edges of the waterways of the central port and the Grand Canal are temple objects used in rituals associated with Osiris. The largest numbers of these are the simpula that you can see here. And their distribution is all widely around the central port and the Grand Canal. Some of them are deliberately destroyed as well. They're ritually killed before being placed into the waters. And here again, we have this link back to ship 11, which was also ritually killed through the removal of its keel plank, and whose scuttling was also ensured that it couldn't be reused like the simpula for any more profane purpose. So consequently, when we're looking at ritual deposition, it's the unusual combination of the deliberate scuttling of a finely built bark in a significant location within the landscape, surrounded by other objects that appear also to have been deliberately deposited as part of temple rituals, that helps us to become more confident in our interpretations. If we had just the ship, it would be, or the boat, it would be much more difficult to come to this ritual interpretation, and instead we'd be looking at more conventional ideas of ship abandonment. So when looked at together, the team from the European Institute of Underwater Archaeology have discovered a great range of ships from Taunus Eraklyon, but they're a highly structured set of vessels which are dominated by the decisions of the inhabitants of this port city about what to reuse and what to recycle. We mostly have large working ships suitable for reuse in infrastructure. We don't have the many smaller vessels, and certainly not the papyrus boats and the coracles that we can see depicted here on the Nilotic mosaic from the sanctuary of Fortuna Primigena at Praeneste in Italy, and these are entirely missing. Also, despite the fact that Taunus Eraklyon was almost certainly a naval base, we have no evidence for warships. And here the issues of state or temple ownership, public or private, will also have played into what could be reused and what could potentially enter the archaeological record. So consequently, when we're trying to understand the depositional variety of ships and boats in Taunus Eraklyon, we need to think carefully about the human agency and set this against the backdrop of the dynamic environment of the port and its long history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damian. That was brilliant. It's really interesting to see how Nathan's work and your work overlap so closely, and despite the fact they're so distant in time and space. I've got loads of questions for you, but we'll have to come back to those afterwards, I think. We're going to move on to Ellie Graham and her team. Didn't get to dive in the Nile, but they did get to wallow on the muddy banks of the Clyde while investigating a late 19th or early 20th century graveyard at New Shot Island. A close look at the rotten old bits of wood sticking out of the mud and the different ways they've arrived at New Shot have revealed several great stories about the rise of Glasgow as a maritime city. So Ellie, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Miranda. I'm going to be speaking about the Nisha Island Boat Graveyard, which was a survey project undertaken by us at Scape in partnership with the NAS, with volunteers and members of the local community. So this is Nisha Island. It's on the River Clyde, just a few miles downstream from the centre of Glasgow. It's actually a former island. The channel that divided it from the South Bank has now been blocked off. And it was a member of the local community, a guy called Ian Sinclair, who first identified interesting features on Google Earth images on the intertidal riverbank in the Relic Channel at New Shot Island. So the archaeological record in Canmore, so that's Scotland's National Monuments Record, stated a connection with a wartime bombing incident and also identified some of these remains as part of the dredging fleet that had once operated on the River Clyde. So there are three main groups of remains on the site. We undertook several seasons of survey using a range of techniques down there, all of which involved local volunteers. So the first step was to carry out a drone flight, which created a three-dimensional structure from motion model, from which we generated our author-rectified site plan that you can see in the background here. So of those three main areas that we were looking at, there are sort of two different thematic groups here and three different types of deposition going on. So first I'm going to speak about is highlighted in red here. It's a group of 4 wooden ships. The lower parts of the hulls are surviving buried in silt on the foreshore. We recorded them in detail. This one you can see here is the best preserved of the 4. There's 2 further almost buried in the encroaching salt marsh, and there's a 4th actually in the channel submerged between the former Nisha Island and the main riverbank. They're all sailing vessels of the sort that would have been very common around the Clyde in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, working the home trade around Scotland and coasting around the Firth of Clyde. So they're the sort of vessels that would have been using the Clyde ports into the 20th century. Now we had that reference in Canmore to a wartime bombing incident, and we knew that the Clydebank Blitz in the Second World War had seriously damaged large parts of this area. However, we unearthed a series of historic aerial photos that showed that these hulks were here prior to the war, as far back as 1934. So their abandonment here predated the Second World War Blitz, and Glasgow wasn't bombed at all during the First World War, so that didn't account for how these ships got here. However, there was a major incident in June 1914 at Kingston Dock in central Glasgow, which was being renovated. A fire started there and very quickly got out of control. It gutted wharves and dockside buildings, and it provoked a lot of major international interest, with lots of reports in the newspapers around the world, which reported that 4 schooners at the dock had been damaged beyond repair. And you can see one of them in the foreground of this image here. There's a strong similarity that you can see between the remains in the picture and those on site at New Shot. We also did some oral history, spoke to a local man whose grandfather remembered seeing 4 ships being towed to New Shot in 1914, still smouldering, and he himself remembers in the 1950s playing on the deck of one of them, with evidence of fire around the stern. Now, the ships are too badly deteriorated for any fire evidence to be visible, but we believe that our remains at New Shot are those of the Kingston Dock schooners. So we think that apocryphal story of wartime bombing can be accounted for by a conflation of dates, 1914 being so strongly associated with the outbreak of the First World War, and then the Clydebank Blitz in the Second World War, which was an extremely traumatic event for the local community here, and that the two were simply sort of merged because of that trauma in local memory. So how did the vessels come to be here at New Shot, and why here? Well, we think the site was probably selected for disposal of the burnt schooners because it's out of the way of the main shipping channel, away from major port activity, but somewhere that they could be towed. The priority would have been keeping the main shipping channels open and avoiding causing any obstruction to them. And New Shot Creek is quite literally a blocked off backwater. So they were dumped because of the fire, but they were probably really already at the end of their working lives, or towards the end of their working lives. This was the period, of course, when sail was ending and the rise of steam. And ironically, old wooden sailing ships like this are now quite rare in the archaeological record, and these examples probably only survive specifically because of their destruction in the fire and the decision to dump them here. So it's quite an interesting type of abandonment and deposition. It sort of sits within that continuum that Nathan was speaking about. The schooners really do represent a premature loss in the catastrophic fire, but their dumping in the specific location at New Shot was selected, and that's the result of a deliberate decision by the port authorities. So moving on to the second group of remains highlighted in red in the structure promotion site plan here. We had the association of the remains with dredging from the Canmore record, and we know that the Clyde was naturally a very shallow river. You can see the depths at the bottom of the slide here. So it did require major deepening operations. There were various strategies employed from the late 18th century onwards by the Clyde Navigation Trust. Steam dredgers were used from the 1820s. They operated with barges which took the spoil away from the dredging grounds. Now these barges, they were ubiquitous. There were fleets of hundreds of them, and you can see the outlines of the rectangular barges on the aerial image here. The 50 or so that we have at New Shot are all that are known to remain of that fleet. But we also have this distinctive metal hull here with that cutout in the stern that's magnified in the top left of the slide. Ian's research had identified this as a diving bell barge. You can see the blueprints underneath the aerial image, and you can see the similarity between the two. So we know from the archives there are two diving bells in operation on the Clyde, the first from 1833, originally operated from a modified wooden punt. However, a specialist support barge was built for it in 1852, and a second bell and barge were built in 1861. A comparison of the remains on site with the specifications for those barges confirms that the New Shot vessel is the earlier of the two, so it actually dates to 1852. So you can see it in action here, and you can see the similarity between it and the remains we have at New Shot. As far as we know, it's the earliest known surviving example of a dive support vessel, and it and the barges are the last survivors of the Clyde dredging fleet, so quite rare and also of significance for the development and history of Glasgow. So in terms of how that came to be here, the records of the Clyde Navigation Trust state it was decommissioned in 1931. It was technologically obsolete by then, and the archives say it was broken up in 33, which probably means that the superstructure and reusable elements would have been removed and salvaged prior to it being dumped here, before it was deliberately discarded at this specific location, and the barges would have been similarly obsolete and dumped at the same time, though they were declining in number really throughout the 20th century, and some continued in use right up to the 60s. There is also evidence of in situ salvage here, so there's been a return to the vessel after its abandonment. There's evidence of cutting with a gas torch and removal of those metal plates around the stern, which we think may have been during the wartime scrap drive. So the site was in use as a boat graveyard for a period of over 20 years, the later dumping of the dredging plant probably representing a deliberate abandonment of vessels that no longer had any value, and the site appears to have been selected for their disposal probably because it was already established in use as a boat graveyards. The schooners had already been dumped here, and people do tend to discard things in the same locations. So we have those groups of vessels are on site by 1934, but there are hints that there's a further group of punts which represent a third set of remains highlighted in red on that structure promotion plan, and are also visible, we think, on the black and white 1937 aerial photo, looking intact and at their moorings. So this site seems to be in use in for mooring the punts that were still active and in use on the Clyde well into the 20th century. So we think there may actually be a third episode of dumping here of some of the very last punts of the dredging fleet in use on the Clyde, which were simply left at their usual moorings. So we've got a third different type of deposition and abandonment illustrated here at this assemblage at the New Shot Island Boat Graveyard. So thanks very much. Thanks to our funders and particularly to the volunteers who did a huge amount of the survey and research. And back to Miranda.
Thank you, Ellie. That was wonderful. So next we're going to move back across the oceans to the Caribbean, which might seem like a bit of a leap, but I know that at least one of the vessels published by Jean-Sébastien Guibert and his co-authors was built on the Clyde, so there's a link. So let's let Jean-Sébastien tell us about the different wreck site processes that have been investigated in Martinique and Guadeloupe. Over to you, Jean-Sébastien.
Okay, thank you very much, Miranda. So, is my ship a wreck? I was thinking about this question by preparing this webinar. And in the article we wrote with several colleagues, a large part focuses on shipwrecks in sites in Guadeloupe and in Martinique. I'd like to thank the co-author I've been working with, Laurence Serra, Max Guérou, and Marc Guillaume, Hannibal, and Frédéric Leroy. This overview only deals with shipwrecks associating hull remains, artifacts, and ballast, not isolated anchors. Is my diaporama on or? Okay. This overview only deals with shipwrecks associating hulls, remains, artifacts, and ballast, not isolated anchors or cannon that should be part of shipwrecks, but which have been scattered by the sea. The question is difficult to answer only with archaeological evidence, and for colonial period, archives are useful to understand maritime risks in French West Indies. Here you have a map of Guadeloupe, here on Martinique, and the location of French West Indies. If we only focus on wrecks presented in the article, we can have this result here on the first table. Most of wrecks causes are unknown. 8 are due to 1 volcanic eruption. I'll come back later on this case. 5 to human errors, and 3 to war, and 3 to climatic hazards. For Martinique, Max Guérou showed several years ago that the risk of Atlantic coast are represented here. On this slide, you can see the Atlantic coast of Martinique. And this coast represented a risk during colonial period, especially by night when sailing ships were arriving to Martinique after transatlantic travel. Several wrecks may be linked with this aspect, as the Edouard or the Cato, which is published in this article. Reef and main currents trapped several ships in the area. Other wrecks in the area are as well due to climatic hazard as the other ship here, the Caravan. For Guadeloupe, thanks to archives, we know that 80% of maritime losses are due to climatic hazard. We can see that on the second table on this slide. And 7% to naval war, 4% to human behavior and human errors, and 8% are unknown. The sample of those results here are 551 wrecks that we have in archives. 75% of maritime losses occurs on ships at mooring when reduced crew during hurricane season. And if we pay attention to wrecks types, most of wrecks are coastal. We can see that on the third table on this slide. Most of them run aground or are cast ashore. 70% are lost without any more information, and only 8.5% are sunk and 5% are destroyed. So we can have an overview of the ship that may be abandoned and not abandoned, or real wreck or not, with those information. If we focus on multiple shipwreck sites presented in the article, the question is interesting for Ancel-à-Barque. Ancel-à-Barque is a very close mooring to Basse-Terre in Guadeloupe. Several wrecks may have been abandoned before they sank, especially the one very close to the shore. Here you can see that on this map site. Here the shipwreck AB3 may be cast ashore, and on the other part of the mooring may have been cast ashore as AB6 or AB7, which is not presented in this map. 3 may have been cast ashore, 3 may have been submerged at mooring, and 2 for sure have been scuttled in 1809. That's the case of Seine and Loire. They scuttled during the English blockade. This cove is known to be a safe mooring and a place for repairing ships during 18th and 19th century, and the cove, as I said, is very close to Basse-Terre, which is a deep water bay. And this cove is very complementary to this Basse-Terre deep water bay. And Saint-Labarque was certainly a place where ships were abandoned too. But during hurricane season, no one mooring is safe enough. For example, the Saint mooring was still considered as a safe mooring at the beginning of 19th century. And it is in this place that the schooner Anemone sunk in 1824, and the site is under excavation since 2016, and the site is located 20 meters deep in the middle of the bay, and the result could give another article in the coming years. In Saint-Pierre, which is a main port in French Antilles in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we have a case that is very different because to date, most of known wrecks are due to 1902 Mont Pelée eruption. Here we can see those wrecks on this map, and those wrecks, deep wrecks, are linked with the 1902 eruption. The Biscay is a wooden sailing ship used in codfish transport. The Rorema, this one is the Rorema is a large propeller cargo, and here the Tamaya, which is the deeper one, is a Cap Horner, and this one, the Diamond, is a coastal steamer. To date, 4 are still unidentified. They all burned and sunk during the blast of the eruption, except the Rorema, which burned during 3 days before it sank. And the only ships that is linked with climatic hazard in Saint-Pierre is this one. This one has been excavated in 2017 and is linked with the 1891 hurricane. It may be a large French three-mast lost at mooring. In Saint-Pierre, the older wrecks known through archives are generally due to climatic hazard, which occurred regularly since 17th century, but those wrecks are known only by archives, and we don't have for now other example of wrecks, older wrecks in this bay. To look for abandoned wrecks, we have to move forward in time in order to find vestiges. On this slide, we can see vestiges of shipwrecks from the 20th century, and they are still visible in the landscape. But this is another question, and I think this is another question for another article and for sure for another author. To conclude, our article presents a state of research at its beginning. Most of studied ships by archaeology are wrecks, but lost in a specific way and linked with West Indies history and West Indies climatic condition. For sure, there is a potential for archaeology to take into consideration this question, especially for multiple wreck sites. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jean-Sébastien. That was great. It's really interesting to see how wrecks get into the same places, but from such a variety of processes. I was thinking particularly about the hurricane season ones alongside the ones that had been scuttled during the English blockade. Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions. But I wanted to start maybe with Damian. Damian, what do you think are the differences or advantages of studying a ship graveyard or assemblage of vessels that has accumulated over time rather than a single shipwreck?
For Egypt, what it gives us is the ability to look at the sort of the long-term history of the site and tell parts of that history through the different types of ships that are deposited at different times. It gives us a kind of a view into the kind of the maritime cultural landscape of it. So different ships tell us different things, essentially. So if we were looking for the ritual story, we could go to the ritual ship. If we were looking for the temple disaster, we could go to those. And it just adds a great deal of richness to the overall picture.
Well, this leads in very nicely to a question that's come in from the audience, and that's this I'll throw out to anyone. Can you think of examples of ship graveyards that span long periods of time, that is centuries rather than decades? So Damian, if we look at the assemblage at Taunus Eraklyon, how many centuries are they covering?
It's from the I don't know, so the third intermediate period through into the sort of the Ptolemaic period. So you're talking 800 years.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good whack. Nathan, perhaps I can throw the same question at you.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of what I've read about, I think the oldest, the one that potentially has the longest period of time would be, if you look at the example of Mellows Bay, which is in the state of Maryland. I might be wrong about this, but I think that they do have abandoned vessels from the Revolutionary War through to and beyond the First World War. But with the majority of the abandonments happening during and after the First World War.
And I think it's interesting what Ellie was saying, that even if it's over a relatively short time period, you can see that once a site is used as a place for abandoning ships, that sticks and will continue over a certain period.
Yeah.
Ellie, I know you've worked on some other ship graveyard sites. Have you seen the same thing on those?
Yeah, thinking about the examples we've worked on in Scotland, it very much has been a case of probably they're develop over time, over shorter periods of time than Damian's been speaking about, but definitely one vessel's been not necessarily dumped but abandoned, and then it's just carried on. Things have sort of coalesced around that. So yeah, things develop gradually, basically because it's a human behaviour. Disposing of a vessel is a problem, I think, in some cases. And if one person's used one site for that, it's easier to carry on using it in the same way.
Sure. Which question do I want to ask next? I've lost questions from my panel, which is going to make things a little tricky.
Okay, no problem. Do you want me to highlight one?
You could highlight one, but I'm going to step in with another question. Well, actually, I'm going to start with Nathan. You mentioned both strategic and ritualistic discard. So I'm thinking, comparing with the ship that Damian talked about that he considers has been ritualistically deposited at Taunus Eraklyon. Have you got other examples of ritually deposited vessels?
I think there's plenty of examples within the archaeological literature. I mean, I think the classic one that you might consider as the Viking Burial. You know, in the context that I've normally been working on, you're looking at 19th and 20th century vessels that are stripped and abandoned, and so the assumption is often that they're artifactually sterile. There's nothing there. That's perhaps an untested assumption in a lot of cases, but then you contrast that with boat burials, where you would obviously have very rich assemblages, but it's really fascinating hearing Damian talk, because this idea of perhaps a ship that isn't at the end of its life, something that's valued, then becomes the abandoned thing rather than the ship that's considered nail sick. So, you know, the contrasts there are quite stark.
Sure. One of the things that occurred to me when I was setting up this webinar was that quite often the shipwrecks that we study from that are actually wrecked, and we find them with their cargo, and they give us lots of ideas about trade and economy. But there's always this nagging fear that what we're looking at is the failures, because they're the ships that sunk, so they're the ones that didn't get to where they were supposed to be going. Do you think that in the ships graveyards we get a better look at the ships that worked? And have you got examples of ships that have had a really long life or that have been reused in several different ways?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the greatest way to think about that idea is that so many vessels that you come across in graveyards, their lifespans were, often there are cases where they're a century long. And one of the first abandoned vessels I got to work on in Australia was the wreck of the Santiago, which is a Clyde-built iron-hulled sailing vessel built in 1856 and abandoned in 1945. Incredibly long period of life, not quite a century, but there are other ones in the historical record that you do see those kinds of long lives. But the other really interesting phenomenon, and maybe other people have seen this too, where you have vessels that are abandoned and the expectation is perhaps they're going to be there and picked apart, salvaged over time, but then you have cases where they're taken out and put back into service again. And that's really, I think, a testament to the success of the construction of the vessel. I think this is predominant in iron and steel vessels, but there have been plenty of cases that I found where you've got well-built wooden vessels that are put back into service, and then maybe they're re-abandoned again. They have multiple events of abandonment within their working life. So they're definitely successful.
Jean-Sébastien, have you got examples in Guadeloupe or Martinique of vessels being reused as port structures or to make harbours safer?
To be honest, not yet, but for the example I presented are very short time period and short time used vessels. And for example, the ships that sank in Saint-Pierre, some of them have been sailing for 30 years before they sank, and that's a kind of very interesting example to have the maritime activity of the end of 19th century in the West Indies, but we don't have such example of a ship that has been reused for dockyards or for wharves, as you presented on the other presentation. But we may find that if we look closer in the tidal area or in the coastal area, and some structure may be discovered by this way. And just for the naval ship I present, they have a very short time life, because that's the contrary. For example, the Anemone, the schooner I've been working on since 2016, the ship was built in 1823 and sunk in the year after. And that's nearly the same for the naval ship in Anse-à-la-Barque. They've been built in 1806 and they sunk in 1809. So it's a very short time period ship.
I've got a question in from the audience. What goes into the selection of a location for an intentional deposition of a ship? So I'm guessing this is ships that have come to the end of their life and are being abandoned. So what are the important things? And I think this is kind of interesting. I want to come back to Damian as well, because you've called the place where you've got all your dumped ships is in the central port.
Mm-hmm.
But is that not unusual to have a dump in your central port, or have we just called that the wrong name? And do you have to rethink how the port was being used at that time? I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to start with maybe we'll go to Ellie. Why do you think that particular place at Newshot was chosen for abandoning those ships?
Well, we don't know, but my my instinct, I think the clues are there that it was probably because it was quite literally an out of the way backwater. So the channel had been blocked off from the main shipping line of the Clyde in the late 18th century. And I think probably their priorities were disposing of these great big pieces of waste that somewhere that they were going to be out of the way. So somewhere they weren't going to foul the main shipping channel. So I think it was probably just a convenient layup spot that was big enough for these great big vessels without too much of a risk of them moving and shifting back into the main channel. Although that fourth one that's now submerged, it did actually move fairly recently, actually within the sort of lifespan of Google Earth. It has actually sort of swung around and blocked the channel. So I think probably the silty bottom, the silty foreshore there as well is probably part of it, in that although quite a lot of the Clyde is muddy and silty in that way, probably because that will sort of the vessels all sink in and be less likely to refloat and then cause an obstruction to the shipping, because yeah, that was absolutely, I think, their priority on the Clyde was keeping the channel open to the big ships using the ports in Glasgow at that point.
So Damian, coming back to you, your central port full of dump ships.
Okay, I think the western end of the central port is a quiet location within that that space. In the northwest, that's where the main entrance to the port comes in from the Nile. But also, you have to look at the long-term history. So that particular entranceway into the port silts up in the 5th, 4th century. And so what was a busy commercial port becomes quite rapidly cut off from the Nile and from the sort of the main centers of trade. And this provides the context in which you can see increased dumping in the ship graveyard, but also things like the construction of the pontoon bridge. So if it was still the main shipping port, the main trading port, then building a bridge across it would actually stop the ships coming into the port in quite a big way. So the dumping events also have to be fitted into the kind of the longer term history of the port, and thought of in those terms as well. So here, especially in Taunus Eraklyon, the geomorphology is really, really important.
Sure. Nathan, have you got anything you want to add to?
Yeah, I think
how
it's
to choose
interesting.
a place to dump your ships?
Yeah, it's the same. It seems to be the same trend in a lot of places. I think the other pattern, that pattern of the out of a way place with good sediment that you're gonna run your vessel into and stick it there is definitely one common characteristic. The other thing that I've seen is that there are often multiple abandonment areas within ports, and especially as that idea of change through time is a really critical one, because of course the ports are changing with trade, and then the abandonment sort of landscape is going to change along with that. But sometimes what also seems to happen is shipbreaking is often occurring near shipbuilding. They have the infrastructure to do the shipbreaking, and while they may be intending to break the ship down to maintain its floating condition to take it to that secondary abandonment location, sometimes they mess it up, and sometimes it's imminently sinking, and so you can sometimes find a closer adjacent location. When you have those deep V, large, especially iron and steel built ships, you maybe can maintain their flotation characteristics and tow them to your intended destination. But in places like in the Port of Adelaide in South Australia, you find other kinds of sites where you might have flat bottom vessels that were wooden. Maybe they were abandoned close by because they were wooden and they wanted to get access to the wood, but also because perhaps they didn't maintain that floating condition and needed to get it abandoned faster before it became an impediment to navigation. So there's definitely a rich spatial relationship between the industries of a port and the locations of abandonment too.
Okay. We've got a lot more questions coming, so have we got a few more minutes to try and answer some of them?
Yes, why not?
Well, yes, why not? Okay, I'm looking down my list. I'm trying to work out. I've got a question from Carlo Beltrami to Damian, who says, in the Adriatic, They found loads of occurrences where every element of a barge was reused. So I think he's meaning broken up and reused in pieces. So have you found elements, broken up elements of reuse in the new structures that are using ships?
Certainly, we do see ship recycling going on. So in ship 17, there are recycled elements within it. So the mast step area is made out of recycled ship timbers. As far as finding ship timbers elsewhere within the sites, I don't know if we have, to be honest, but obviously I could find out more about that from Frank and the rest of the team.
Okay, so I'm going to finish with my question, which is, what is the strangest reuse of a boat you've seen or recorded anywhere? Nathan, you must have collected some very strange boat reuses.
Yeah, floating grain silos are a strange one. Residence vessels in various different locations. What's another one? The bridges, that's quite a common one. Yeah, to think about that one a bit more for the strangeness. Yeah.
Anyone else got a favorite reused boat to tell me about? Oh, Ellie, I thought you were going to come in with small boats used as roofs on sheds in Scotland for me, or
Yeah,
some such thing.
that is a particularly good one. In Shetland particularly, they do turn boats upside down because, you know, they tend to be waterproof and use them as roofing material. Yeah, that's quite a specific type of vernacular architecture that works.
Thank you all for tuning in and for joining in with your questions. Many thanks to our panel. That's Nathan Richards, Damian Robinson, Ellie Graham and John Sebastian Guibert. If you haven't read their articles yet, they are available open access through the Wiley IJNA website. Do go and check out the journal. While you're there, have a nose around. There's plenty of other articles to have a look at. I'm sure you'll find something you enjoy. And I want to thank the Honor Frost Foundation for their financial support for taking the journal to a wider audience. And I want to thank Mark Beattie Edwards and everybody in the Nautical Archaeology Society office who's helped set this up. The next one will probably be in the autumn, so please do look out for it. Thank you very much.